So in this video I'm going to be finishing up the simple cabinet build, and to do that I'm going to mock up these hinges to show you how they're going to be mounted. These are overlay doors, so as long as all your doors are the same height, they're, in my opinion, probably the easiest types of doors to mount. These are partial overlay hinges. If you go to the store to buy overlay hinges, there's multiple kinds you can get. These are partial overlay. They're designed for doors that are next to each other, similar to how you would have them in a cabinet. So as you saw with the mock-up on that piece of plywood, they only overlay the face frame of the cabinet. I think it's like 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. So that way I could have all those doors nested next to each other without them hitting each other as they open. So I just put that mock-up on there. I marked where they're going to go, basically measured in between the marks, accounted the reveals already in there because of the way that they're going to be mounted, so I can go about calculating the measurements for the doors. You can see they're all going to be about 14.5 inch wide, and the height was already set. That's the easier part of this build. I think it was 28.5. So for my stiles, I'm going to cut those to final size. If you're new to making doors, you can keep those long and trim them down later. There's nothing wrong with that. I've made enough of these, I can usually get them all fairly accurate the first go around. So these longer parts, I'm cutting my stiles, like I said, long. And then my rails, I cut those down to smaller pieces, but I keep them long because they'll be cut later. All of them are going to get a groove, so I basically find center, and then you're going to set your fence up off center of that line. So you're going to be cutting about 1/8 of an inch on either side of that center mark. I'm going to send it through, flip the board around and send it through again, and that will give me a perfectly centered mark on my board. These saw blades from Freud are not exactly 1/8 of an inch, so you can see I have a little piece of material left in the middle. You could either chisel that out, or usually what I do is at the end I'll move the fence over and just remove that as well. After my first piece, I always make a couple test pieces of these, especially when it gets to the tongue. You'll want to dial that in, but I make sure they fit on the material I'm putting on the inside of the doors, because this plywood is very randomized nowadays. You'll get varying sizes even within certain shipments. So like I said, I just make sure they all fit before going forward. If your groove is too big, that's a problem, but it's also a problem if you go to cut it and it's too small. So once I have that groove in all of my pieces, I can line these up. In real life, without filming, I usually don't do this. I just do the math, but it's easier to visualize what's going on if you draw the marks on there. So I have the marks where the tongue depth is, and I have both of my stiles at outside edges the exact measurement I want. So you can see I could line this rail up against that first mark and then mark where it has to be cut to, because you're not cutting to the inside of the frame, you're cutting accounting for the depth of the tongue. I think on this one it was about 3/4 of an inch. I usually make them between 1/2 inch and 3/4. On bigger doors I will do bridle joints. So then I marked on here the material that has to be removed. It's basically about 3/4 of an inch down to where the material is going to meet the groove, and I just set up a stop on the radial arm saw, my dado stack in place, and I could cut all of this at one time. You can also cut these with a miter gauge on the table saw, but the nice thing about the radial arm saw accepting a dado stack is, depending on what I'm doing, I could set it up in either tool and then flip back and forth instead of having to keep taking the stack in and out. And then this is all testing. This is a test piece. I make sure it fits nicely, so that's really dependent on not only my stop being in the right place, but the saw cutting the right amount of material. Once I have a nice fit, I can mock this up. So then I once again put marks on the outside of this frame for where all of my tongues end and where my grooves are, and then I can measure in between those marks for the inner panel, and I can cut those. I usually cut these about at least 1/16 of an inch short of what I'm doing, just so that there's a little bit of room for movement. and then I can glue these together. 4 doors is pretty easy to make. I can make something like this in about an hour. Gluing them up, I'm only gluing the frame. I'm not gluing the frame to the plywood. The plywood's dimensionally stable, but that outer poplar frame is not. So as that frame moves with the seasons, as it gains and loses moisture, the wood will expand and then it will shrink. If that plywood frame is glued in place, it could actually put some cracks in it. Once I had those set up and dried, I usually let stuff like this set up overnight. I can start doing the hinges, so I could drill all of my cups. The position of those hinges was basically to avoid the face frame, because it's so big on this one, the top and the bottom. So it was about 4 inches in, and sometimes I cut these by hand, but it was easy enough also to do it on the drill press, so I could set up the fence and get them all in the perfect spot. And then just attach those hinges and then mock them up. So for this, like I said, because that face frame's so big, what I did on this was I just mocked up where the bottom of the door is going to be. I clamped a piece of wood to my frame so that I could just set the door on there and creep inside and mark where the holes are going to be. The back at this point is kind of permanently attached. It could come off, but it would probably tear a little bit because there was definitely some glue squeeze out. On some projects I leave the back off. It's easier to mount the hinges with the back off. But as you can see on this one, I just mocked up that piece of wood so you're not teetering with the door trying to make marks. Once I had the marks, I could pre-drill the holes and then just attach the door. These are soft closed doors, but I turn that setting off when I'm mounting things because it's a pain in the butt. And then I could just measure at this point where to drill those holes. If you're wondering why I'm doing this way, is I find it's just as accurate as reading instructions. And if you're ordering hinges like this off of Amazon, they are not going to come with instructions anyway. You're going to have to go to the website to find them. So this is just kind of the way I do it. And then, like I said, once you know how far set back those hinges have to be, I could just mark them and mock them up that way. And after that, it's a pretty easy process. Like I said, as long as your doors are the same height and they're square, this is going to go pretty quickly. You can see the reveals. Where the centers, it's going to be a little bit thicker, and everything's looking pretty good at this point. And then there's many adjustments to be had on these hinges, but I take everything apart to paint it. So for the time being, I basically get it to the point where I know they're going to work at the end if there's any tweaking to be done. But like I said, with these doors, as long as you make your doors the exact same size and they're square, they're going to mock up. Inset doors are usually where you have to play around with things. So I don't do a bunch of adjustment on the hinges at this point. So then really the last thing I have to make at this point is the top. I'm putting a hardwood edge on the top. I don't love that glue-on veneer. I will use it, but I try to avoid it. I hate using it, and I don't think it's as durable as hardwood. So I already had my pieces cut with the tongue that are going on the edges because I cut them all at the same time when I did the face frame. So I just used one of those pieces to line back up my dado stack and then cut a groove on all sides of my top. When you're doing it like this, the math can get a little complicated because you're actually making that top small so that when you add the 3/4 inch material, it overhangs. And then while I was here, I had enough leftover material. I'm also going to put a hardwood edge on all of my shelves. So I just cut 2 miters on the edges of that pieces I cut a couple weeks ago at this point for the top, and then I left them long. I was working on a bunch of other projects at the time, so this was kind of sitting around the shop for a week or two without much work done. But like I said, I already had these pieces cut from the face frame. Then I could cut a miter, a matching miter on one edge, and then come to the other side and mark where it's going to be. Instead of calculating everything, I like to do it that way, cut the miters as I go so they're accurate, and then the top can all be glued into place. For these shelves, you can see I put the hardwood edge on that shelf, but on the longer shelves, they're long enough. I believe she said she wanted to put a printer on one of these, that I decided to put a thicker edge on the front. instead of running this through the edge, I just flipped it on its flat side, sent it through again, so that groove's going to be in the exact same spot. It will line up with the top, but it's a thicker piece for that front, so that any sort of weight they put on this, it shouldn't, the cabinet, the shelf shouldn't bow. Can mark it in place, cut it to size, and then attach it with some brads. Paint, this is going to be painted, so you can get away with some putting brads in there and putting them without much of an issue, and avoid having to clamp that. So then everything was ready for final sanding. I usually buy sandpaper from Lowe's because it's convenient, but recently I've noticed the quality of it has gone downhill. So I was on some forums reading, and people recommended this 3M extract paper. I sanded this whole cabinet with one disc of paper. It also worked really quickly, and I think once I get that protective pad they recommend for my sander, it will work even better. This is not a sponsored post or anything like that. I just like to tell people about things that I switch to or use around the shop that I like. I won't be switching back to the paper they have at Lowe's. So then I took out the spray gun for this because it is going to give you the nicest finish. It's a little bit of a longer process than rolling because this gun's going to put on very thin coats, as you can see. And what I like to do is I like to put on a coat of primer, and then the primer is going to kind of show you all your patch spots. So I like to patch hairline cracks with that putty, and then stuff like the seams where the cabinets are in the back there. If you build up paint, it will hide these sorts of seams, but I just like to caulk them as added insurance. So instead of raising the grain or anything like that before paint, I like to put on a coat of primer. I like to patch everything, and then I'll go through and sand it before I put on another coat of primer. I just feel like it eliminates a step, because as you prime this stuff, the primer, this is going to be a water-based primer, water-based paint. It is going to raise the grain of the lumber, so you will have to sand them either before or after. But I kind of combine patching with that sanding phase. So it was like 3 or 4 coats of primer, because like I said, it goes on real thin with that spray gun, and then multiple coats of top coat. And then she wanted this to be lightly distressed. You could see I went through and sanded it. She also wanted some holes in this for plugs and wires. So I found this kit online that not only came with the grommets, but it came with a hole saw. I like to drill through the front and then switch to the back so I don't get any tear out on either side. I could just pop those plugs in, put all the shelves back in place. She wanted to come look at the distressing on the cabinet before I delivered it, which is fine. I would totally prefer someone do that, find something they don't like, so I could fix it in the shop, then deliver a piece of furniture and have to make changes. For the knobs, I just used a laser level to get my marks, and then I could drill the holes and attach the knobs. Pretty simple. Simple black knobs right in the center. And then this is basically it. The finished product. I was happy with how this turned out. Like I said, I don't love paint, but especially for a project like this, which is an easier sort of cabinet, it makes it even easier if it's paint grade quality. Like I said, you can hide I wouldn't say you're intentionally making it poorly, but stuff like little hairline cracks on doors, you could easily fill and patch and make it look perfect, versus staining. It's much harder to do stuff like that.